previous 4 episodes on Joan Lindsay's Picnic at Hanging Rock, I have explored the swan motif, the rock itself, the novel's Gothic genre, as well as proposing a feminist reading of the text. This variety of approaches underlines the wide range of interpretive stances which can be adopted in relation to this and, in fact, any substantial or significant text. In this episode, I want to first introduce the concept of intersectionality, and then, on the basis of this framework, move to a postcolonial reading of Joan Lindsay's iconic novel. The term intersectionality was coined by the American academic Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. Here is a definition we can use for our present purposes. Intersectionality is an approach to literary analysis that invites the study of how a range of identity factors such as gender, race, nationality, class, sexuality, age, physical ability, corporeality, role or setting interact to enable discrimination or oppression. What is distinctive about this approach is its acknowledgement that these various factors act together in a way that is multiplicative and overlapping. Consider, for example, how the framework of intersectionality might be applied to the experiences of an Indigenous Australian woman in the 21st century. To take into account just racism or just sexism as distinct categories of discrimination would be to ignore not only the relationships between these two categories, but also the further potential overlap with other categories such as age or socioeconomic status. In recent literary scholarship, intersectionality has become important in postcolonial studies, as our knowledge of the complexity of the issue and of its clusters of interrelationships has expanded. In previous episodes, I have already touched on some aspects of postcolonial theory as it relates to Picnic at Hanging Rock, especially in regard to the Australian landscape, to the novel's Gothic genre, and to certain of the cultural issues to which Lindsay alludes in her novel. In this present episode, I will explore a postcolonial reading of the text, while acknowledging that this also requires aspects of that framework of intersectionality which I have just referenced. We will start with a working definition of postcolonialism and expand our understanding of its complexities as the episode progresses. Postcolonialism is the study of the cultural legacy of colonialism and imperialism, which are the human consequences of the control and exploitation of colonized people and their lands. Postcolonial theory takes many different shapes and interpretive forms, but all of them share a fundamental assumption that it is impossible to understand the world we currently inhabit without accounting for our relationship to the history of imperialism and colonial rule. Although various peoples and nations have been invaded, colonized, and exploited throughout history, postcolonial theory in literary texts generally concerns itself with the political, cultural, economic, historical, and social impact of European colonial rule around the world in the 18th through to the 20th century. By 1914, most of the world's nations had been subjected to colonization by Europeans at some point in history. Now, to understand postcolonialism, we should also give the term colonialism some attention as well, and establish a clear distinction between the terms. Colonialism is the control by one foreign power over a dependent area or people. In the second half of the 19th century in Europe, colonialism received a powerful shot in the arm from the theory of social Darwinism. Now, it's important to remember that this theory did not come directly from Charles Darwin himself. In fact, his radical theories regarding natural selection, as outlined in the middle of the 19th century, applied only to biology and the natural world. However, by 1870, the concept of the survival of the fittest had begun to infiltrate the disciplines of sociology, economics, and politics. Social Darwinists argued that certain people become powerful in society because they are innately better, more intelligent, or more civilized. In its most extreme form, social Darwinism allows a dominant race to invade, exploit, or exterminate a weaker one. Historically, social Darwinism has found catastrophic expression and a welcome home in regimes such as Nazi Germany and Communist China. Closer to home, we Australians have witnessed our own such atrocities. In a 2005 article entitled Social Darwinism and the Language of Racial Oppression, Jeffrey Daffer critiques the policies adopted by a succession of Australian governments, which were designed to precipitate the extinction of Aboriginal peoples on the island continent. So, having established definitions for our key terms, let's look at a very illustrating the difference between a colonialist reading and a post-colonialist reading. A colonialist reading endorses or promotes the view that a stronger power may legitimately exert control over another which is perceived to be geopolitically or culturally weaker. A post-colonialist reading critiques or rejects the way that a stronger power may legitimately exert control over another which is perceived to be geopolitically or culturally weaker. Post-colonial literature has several aims. It seeks to give a voice to the colonized subject. It looks to highlight racist behavior on the part of colonizers. It intends to expose the colonizers' motives. And it strives to educate readers on the cultural and religious beliefs of other countries and races. If there were any post-colonial sensitivities when the novel was published in 1967, they are not reflected in the reviews which appeared in print. The novel was launched in Melbourne on November the 1st, 1967, All Saints' Day, by Robert Menzies, who had twice been Prime Minister of Australia and was a long-time friend of the Lindsays. There were some notable reviews, but little feeling for the novel becoming an Australian classic. One critic, Martha Lemming, likened it to a, quote, faded watercolour, unquote. The highly regarded and highly influential Bulletin magazine opined that the novel was, quote, too sunlit to be called Gothic, unquote. Possibly the longest assessment was written by a reviewer using the pen name Scrutarius in Walkabout magazine, who fails to take the novel seriously, dismissing its plot as simplistic and stereotypical. Like the other reviewers, Scrutarius demonstrates little to no awareness of the novel's colonial or post-colonial qualities, referring only to the rock's, quote, dangerous escarpments, monoliths, and reputedly bottomless holes, unquote. The last line of the review states that, quote, one does get the feel of the rock and its potential for tragedy, unquote. Critics of the impact of colonialism in Australia have identified a number of important tropes, which can also be found in Picnic at Hanging Rock. First, let's explore the term trope. In literature, or the arts in general, a trope is a figure of speech, a plot element, theme, motif, or visual cue, which is recognizable and recurring. Some examples are: a damsel in distress is rescued by a handsome prince. A hopeless team gets a great coach and surprises everyone by beating all the established teams. A child prodigy takes the adult world by storm. A jealous lover seeks revenge by killing either his rival or the woman he loves, or both. An ugly duckling realizes its true beauty. A teacher takes on a seemingly impossible class and wins them over. I'm sure you could think of many more, as our books, films, plays, operas and musicals are full of them. Certain of the numerous tropes in Picnic at Hanging Rock can be used to construct a post-colonial reading. Some of these overlap, and some are more complex than others. But here, to start with, is a short list whose relevance I will shortly expand on. The white vanishing trope, the terra nullius trope, the alien landscape trope, the haunted mansion trope, the Sir Galahad trope, the frozen time trope. The white vanishing trope has been popular in Australia since the earliest days of colonisation. In her book White Vanishing, Rethinking Australia's Lost in the Bush myth, Professor Elspeth Tilley examines this trope in detail through a variety of relevant print and film texts. In a 2017 magazine interview, she summarised the trope as follows. A white person goes into the bush and becomes suddenly disoriented. They may have been able to see a track, and it's as though the track suddenly disappeared. Or maybe they might have known what time of day it was, and all of a sudden they become disoriented about what time it is. Then they get very panicked, and they either die and are never recovered, or they are rescued by their gallant white community. But either way, there tends to be a marker placed on the landscape recognizing where they were and where they died. And then the story gets retold. There is, of course, an element of truth in Tilley's abbreviated formula. There were instances of white settlers who went missing, and to this day, the monuments to their disappearance can still be found. In Lindsay's novel, Constable Bumfer exclaims to Mrs. Appleyard, "You've no idea how many people get themselves lost if they stray a few yards off the beaten track." However, the objective historical record has progressively been overtaken by the sheer volume of fictional accounts depicting white tragedies. This obsession, some scholars argue, has served to conveniently drown out the crimes and atrocities in which certain colonists were actively complicit. It's important to remember that Lindsay herself inherited fragments of just such a narrative tradition when, as a young schoolgirl, she read a brief article in a school magazine, written by a Miss McCraw. The unremarkable article dealt with a photographic excursion to Hanging Rock, led by the article's writer. What seems to have captured Lindsay's imagination are some of the more evocative details, such as the references to the schoolgirls departing, quote, freshly clad, unquote, but returning as, quote, sorry objects, unquote. The white person Tilley refers to in her description of the vanishing trope has often been a child, which seems to have become a particularly Australian obsession. In his 1999 book, The Country of Lost Children and Australian Anxiety, Peter Pearce argues that, quote, the lost child is an arresting figure in the history and the folklore of colonial Australia. More profoundly, though, the lost child is the symbol of essential, if never fully resolved anxieties within the white settler communities of this country, unquote. Let's focus for a moment on some aspects of this obsessive behaviour. Certain writers have argued that the early colonisers tended to psychologically repress any acknowledgement of the damage which their behaviour caused to the land in which they were attempting to settle. The classic rationalisation which enabled this repression borrowed heavily from the popularisation of social Darwinism and ran as follows. This untamed land of savages will benefit enormously from our civilizing influence, which we, being innately superior, generously bring to this hostile place. In Joseph Conrad's late 19th century novella Heart of Darkness, which deals with the European exploitation of the Congo, Joseph Marlowe's aunt parrots this very attitude when she refers to the Congolese mission as, quote, weaning those ignorant millions from their horrid ways, unquote. Around the same time, the French Empire pursued what was called la mission civilisatrice, the self-ascribed civilizing mission, which proposed that some races and cultures have a higher purpose in life and are therefore entitled to colonize other peoples in service of the noble idea of civilization. Rationalizations such as this one have been used around the globe and throughout history by colonizers whose real interests have been economic or political rather than humanitarian. In Picnic at Hanging Rock, the white child of greatest significance is Miranda, around whom two schools of thought have emerged in recent literary criticism. The pro-Miranda camp, represented by writers such as Kathleen Steele, proposed that she may represent, through having been born in this country, what she calls a, quote, subsumation into the landscape, unquote, which is an unconscious attempt to create a kind of ancestor spirit for future native-born Europeans in Australia. It's certainly true that Lindsay presents Miranda as a pseudo-indigenous persona. In the story about the girl's disappearance, which Ben Hussey relates to Constable Bumfer, he states that Miss Miranda, who is well used to the bush, would have kept her head and found some safe place to shelter for the night. Later in the novel, Mrs. Appleyard expresses a similar sentiment in her discussions with Bumfer. My head girl Miranda was born and bred in the bush. The anti-Miranda camp, however, rejects this romanticization of the lost child trope, seeing it rather as a socially constructed obfuscation with an inherently political instrumentality, as a misguided attempt at creating a self-indigenizing mythology of belonging, and as a transactional strategy for claiming ownership of the land by having paid the price of suffering, and lastly, as a cover-up of colonial brutality. In a 2018 doctoral thesis, Amy Spears launched a conceptual campaign entitled Miranda Must Go, through which she sought to emphasize the indigenous history of Hanging Rock over the fictional pseudo-history created by Joan Lindsay. She argued that this is necessary because white Australians have become so heavily invested in denying their colonial past, which involves illegal occupation and dispossession. An overlapping trope which connects strongly with much of what I have outlined so far is the terra nullius trope, which in turn intersects quite strikingly with the alien landscape trope. These tropes raise complex socio-cultural issues, but in order to contain our discussion, I will focus them in the main on their relevance to Lindsay's Picnic at Hanging Rock. The Latin expression terra nullius, which means nobody's land, was adopted by the British colonisers of Australia, who regarded the continent as terra nullius at the time of original white settlement. This designation was at the centre of several important legal cases, including the 1992 Mabo decision, which overturned the doctrine of terra nullius in Australia. Historically, however, and in conjunction with the theories of social Darwinism, terra nullius became a geopolitically charged weapon against the recognition of and the acknowledgement of the rights of Indigenous Australians. The assumption which Europeans brought with them that, as the providers of history to the blank canvas of the Australian continent, they could ignore or erase any culture that had preceded them, remained unchallenged by mainstream social discourse well into the 20th century, and even retains some supporters to this day. In contrast to this Eurocentric worldview, the place we know today as Hanging Rock had been inhabited for some 26,000 years by the Dja Dja Wurrung, Woiwurrung and Taungurrung peoples before their eviction from it by European settlers in the 19th century, who also introduced diseases such as smallpox, which ravaged the local population. The culturally significant site was a dividing point for 4 Aboriginal territories, who refused to climb the heights of the rock on account of the extraordinary power they attributed to it. Contrary to the perception created by Lindsay that Hanging Rock was trackless, it was in fact heavily tracked, which seems logical given that it was a meeting point and training location for multiple tribes. The passage in which Lindsay denies the absence of tracks is quite telling for a number of reasons. There are no tracks on this part of the rock, or if there ever have been tracks, they are long since obliterated. It is a long, long time since any living creature, other than an occasional rabbit or wallaby, trespassed upon its arid breast. The reference to the possibility of tracks having been long since obliterated fails to recognize that it was only a half-century before the period in which the novel is set that the local indigenous population was driven out. The references to living creatures excludes humans. The verb trespassed carries some sense of defining a sacred site, and the reference to the rock's arid breast conveys a sense of maternal inadequacy. By depicting the site in some instances as a primordial wilderness, Lindsay also inevitably erases millennia of human history. While the author does reference the supernatural powers of the rock, she does so without any acknowledgement of its indigenous significance or of its previous history of human occupation. Lindsay's narrative seems rather to imply that the party which visits it on Valentine's Day, as well as the Colonel, his wife and Michael Fitzhubert, is entitled to presume ownership of it as a strange and curious occasional recreational site. Much of this trivialization of Hanging Rock's true identity is captured in the very word picnic. That the site appears to a white mentality as an interesting place for a weekend outing sums up the attitude of ignorance and arrogance with which a post-colonial reading of Lindsay's novel must inevitably contend. There is a degree of shared wonder at the uniqueness of the rock as spectacle and geological marvel, but this wonder is perceived and translated by the characters through a Eurocentric filter. Its connection with an indigenous past is never articulated, nor is there any specific respect shown to it as a sacred site. Furthermore, the eradication of the local Aboriginal population receives no direct acknowledgement, although one line in the text unintentionally alludes to it. On Monday, unless the mystery had been solved, a black tracker was being brought from Gippsland and, at the instigation of Colonel Fitzhubert, a bloodhound, for whom certain articles of the missing person's clothing were labelled by Miss Lumley and handed over at the constable's request. Notice that the Aboriginal black tracker must be brought from Gippsland, nearly 400 kilometres away, given the absence of similarly capable Indigenous men in the immediate vicinity. In this passage, there is also a very subtle implication which equates the black tracker with the bloodhound, thereby insinuating a kind of similarity of purpose and status. At this point, it's important to understand the relationship between the behaviour and attitudes of Lindsay's characters and her own authorial agenda. At a basic level, there are three positions we can recognise: agreement, disagreement, and ambiguity. The least common of these is agreement. In many instances, Lindsay presents her characters in such a way as to signal to us the inauthenticity or erroneousness of their behaviour. At times, this manifests as a kind of satire, especially in relation to characters such as Mrs. Appleyard and Greta McCraw. Ambiguity arises in a small number of circumstances and contexts, one of which I will illustrate shortly, but it is disagreement which dominates the relationship between Lindsay and her characters. For the purposes of a post-colonial reading, it is the Eurocentric attitude of the characters to the land and its indigenous peoples which concerns us most. Lindsay highlights their dominant tendency to miss the metaphysical and spiritual qualities of Hanging Rock, granting such an awareness to only a privileged few. But even this awareness is still a white European one, which fails to connect with an indigenous worldview or to acknowledge prior human occupation or cultural heritage. To put it simply, Lindsay is able to convey authorially a deeper awareness of the rock's mystical singularity than most of her characters possess, but it can never be a truly indigenous awareness. This position of disagreement does not reveal an author who is interested in a postcolonial stance, but rather suggests one who is committed to a kind of spiritualism beyond the perceptive capacities of most of her adult characters and available only to the aforementioned few. In other words, I don't see Lindsay as an advocate for Indigenous rights or recognition, but I do see her novel as being wide open to a postcolonial reading. Along with the belief in early white Australia that this ancient land belonged to nobody, an overwhelming perception also emerged that it was a hostile and largely uninhabitable place, a perception often conveyed through the alien landscape trope. Only a few pages into the novel, Mrs. Appleyard endorses this view when she tells the girls, "Once again, let me remind you that the rock is extremely dangerous, and you are therefore forbidden to engage in any tomboy foolishness in the matter of exploration, even on the lower slopes. It is, however, a geological marvel, on which you will be required to write a brief essay on Monday morning. I also wish to remind you that the vicinity is renowned for its venomous snakes and poisonous ants of various species." This discourse of danger, toxicity and fatality in relation to the rock continues through to the final chapter, where, in a fictional extract from a Melbourne newspaper, the writer reports that it was thought at the time that the missing persons had attempted to climb the dangerous rock escarpments near the summit, where they presumably met their deaths. The characteristic European response to an alien landscape has been to tame it, domesticate it, so that it conforms to the inherited aesthetic hegemony. The following passage illustrates the imposition of an imported horticultural paradigm which takes advantage of the natural qualities of the landscape. The road wound its charming, leisurely way between sleeping gardens, still heavy with dew and shadowed by the upper mountain slopes. Swathes of virgin forest ran right down to an immaculate tennis lawn, an orchard, a row of raspberry canes. The lush, luxuriant gardens were unlike anything Michael had seen in England. There was a heartbreaking innocence about them, a sort of casual gaiety that proclaimed them pleasure gardens, redeeming the undistinguished architecture of red-roofed houses set amongst willow and maple, oak and elm. The rich volcanic soil on which roses glowed all summer long with an almost tropical brilliance was watered by innumerable mountain streams cunningly deployed. Here a ferny grotto, there a pool of goldfish spanned by a rustic bridge, a tea house above a miniature waterfall. Mike was enchanted by this strangely favoured country, where palms, delphiniums and raspberry canes grew side by side. No wonder his uncle hated returning to Melbourne at the end of the summer. Before I attend to the detail of this instructive passage, let me return to the concept of authorial ambiguity which I raised earlier on. We see it at work here, where the omniscient narrator affirms both natural and man-made phenomena as well as their mutuality. The college's English gardener has learnt to exploit the wonderful natural qualities of the soil to propagate his imported species, and so there is a kind of trade-off at work in the hybridity of this process and the way Lindsay describes it. The passage is full of literary devices and telling observations which enhance this sense of ambiguity. The manicured gardens are personified as sleeping, but are in the shadows of the upper mountain slopes. There is a meeting point between swathes of virgin forest and what Lindsay describes as, quote, an immaculate lawn, unquote, reinforcing the way in which it has been shaped and controlled by European intervention. Again, there is an ambiguity in the use of the word virgin, which could be an affirmation of the untouched beauty of the forest, or alternatively, a means of comparing it unfavourably with the immaculate lawn. The gardens are lush and luxuriant precisely because of the ancient volcanic soil. The hyperbolically, quote, innumerable mountain streams, unquote, are, quote, cunningly deployed, unquote, and enhanced in the European mind by various constructions, including a rustic bridge, the adjective rustic suggesting that it belongs in the countryside, a tea house, and a miniature waterfall. The desired pleasurable effect of these artifices on the European psyche is emblematized by Michael's sense of enchantment with them. The last sentence in the paragraph in Free Indirect Discourse reinforces a wider Eurocentric endorsement of this kind of horticulture by including the Colonel as another significant figure who approves of these manicured gardens. The reshaping of the natural landscape into a garden in the English style is not the only manifestation of environmental control evident from the activities of the white settlers. It was also important for them to tame the landscape by constructing homes and public buildings in the English style. The trope of the haunted mansion is developed compellingly by Lindsay in her descriptions of Appleyard College and the strange happenings therein. Early in the novel, Lindsay describes the college as, quote, an architectural anachronism in the Australian bush, a hopeless misfit in time and place, unquote. She goes on to underline the grotesqueness and incongruity of the mansion. The clumsy two-storey mansion was one of those elaborate houses that sprang up all over Australia like exotic fungi following the finding of gold. Why, this particular stretch of flat, sparsely wooded country, a few miles out of the village of Macedon, crouching at the foot of the mount, had been selected as a suitable building site, nobody will ever know. The insignificant creek that meandered in a series of shallow pools down the slope at the rear of the 10-acre property offered little inducement as a setting for an Italianate mansion. It comes as no surprise that what the narrator has so roundly critiqued nevertheless appeals greatly to Mrs. Appleyard, who regards it as perfect for her quasi-educational enterprise. To Mrs. Appleyard, newly arrived from England with a considerable nest egg and letters of introduction to some of the leading Australian families, the mansion, standing well back from the Bendigo Road behind a low stone wall, was immediately impressive. Notice that Mrs. Appleyard is newly arrived from England, which highlights her identity as a colonizer with no appreciable knowledge of the local customs or culture. The mansion is so congenial to her and such a comforting reminder of the world she has only just left behind that she finds it immediately impressive. As the novel progresses, Lindsay undertakes a process of melding the college and its Gothic singularity with, in the first instance, the personality of Mrs. Appleyard herself, and in the second instance, with the rock and the power it exerts over the novel's people, places, and objects. The consequence of this first melding process is that Mrs. Appleyard, so used to the trappings of so-called civilization, loses all consciousness of her relationship to the natural world. In chapter 16, Lindsay underlines this disconnectedness as the headmistress begins her crazed, suicidal trek to the rock. And now, at last, after a lifetime of linoleum and asphalt and Axminster carpets, the heavy, flat-footed woman trod the springing earth. Born 57 years ago, in a suburban wilderness of smoke-grimed bricks, she knew no more of nature than a scarecrow rigid on a broomstick above a field of waving corn. She who had lived so close to the little forest on the Bendigo Road had never felt the short, wiry grass underfoot, never walked between the straight, shaggy stems of the stringy-bark trees, never paused to savour the jubilant gusts of spring that carried the scent of wattle and eucalypt right into the front hall of the college, nor sniffed with foreboding the blast of the north wind, laden in summer with the fire ash of mountain fires. In the same way that the mansion has been identified as a misfit in time and space, so too is its human incarnation, Mrs. Arthur Appleyard. The Englishwoman is exposed as resistant to and ignorant of this ancient and natural world at her doorstep. The second melding process is dramatically enacted when the surviving girls experience a terrifying mass hallucination of the rock while inside their gymnasium. The dreadful shape is a living monster, lumbering towards them across the plain, scattering rocks and boulders. So near now, they can see the cracks and hollows where the lost girls lie rotting in a filthy cave. The light voice of authority goes unheard as the smouldering passion, long banked down under the weight of grey disciplines and secret fears, bursts into flames. Not even the colonialist buildings can protect them now from the indigenous power of the rock. The reference here to bursting into flames also foreshadows the demise of Mrs. Appleyard's idealised mansion. At the end of the novel, we learn that, quote, the cottage itself was totally destroyed by a bushfire during the following summer, unquote, an act of nature which challenges the ideal of the British Empire as an indestructible power. The immolation of this misfit building, which is nevertheless the epitome of all Englishness, represents through the biblical symbolism of a burnt offering an atonement with the abused and maltreated. Destruction by fire spells annihilation, and in the Australian context opens the way to a regeneration of the land. The alien landscape trope, which we have been exploring, is closely allied with the frozen time trope, which constitutes a particularly disturbing subversion of a foundational element in the human perception and construction of reality. The earliest societies and civilizations appear to have experienced time as a cyclical phenomenon, with what sociologists have called a, quote, present orientation, unquote, as opposed to modern Western societies in which time is understood to be essentially linear. Author Margaret Bain contends that in the cosmology of Australian Aborigines, time is treated from a descriptive point of view in which it is regarded as an eternal quality, intimately linked to the dreaming. In Picnic at Hanging Rock, time is refracted through the prism of subjective historical perception. The timelessness of Australia is confronted by received Cartesian notions of time as protensive, that is, always moving forward, and the presumed permanence of the colony is juxtaposed to the fluidity of the natural and cultural time. Edith's horror at Marion's assertion that the rock must be 1,000,000 years old reflects her inability to grasp an infinite time before she existed, and reinforces the European assumption that Australian history began with the landing of the first fleet, and that the continent has, to all intents and purposes, always been empty. At the same time, the European, having no deep historical links with the colonised land, brings an imported historico-cultural awareness which appears essentially irrelevant and incongruous in this new and challenging environment. When Michael is climbing the rock, this psychological referentialism manifests in the dominant thought which bubbles up to consciousness. There was only one conscious thought in his head: go on. A Fitzhubert ancestor, hacking his way through bloody barricades at Agincourt, had felt much the same way, and had in fact incorporated those very words in Latin in the family crest: go on. Mike, some 5 centuries later, went on climbing. The Battle of Agincourt, in which the English achieved a spectacular and unexpected victory over the French in the year 1415, seems banal and out of place when contrasted against this ancient land as the white rescuer in what is sometimes called the Sir Galahad trope. Remember our earlier reference to Elspeth Tilley and the way she summarised the white vanishing trope. She referred to lost white settlers being rescued by their gallant white community. Sir Galahad is a knight of King Arthur's Round Table, renowned for his gallantry and purity as the most perfect of all knights. He is capable of performing miracles such as banishing demons and healing the sick. On the quest for the Holy Grail, he usually travels solo, defeating and often sparing enemies, rescuing fellow knights and saving maidens in distress. The parallels with Michael Fitzhubert are significant. He is young, only 20 years old, English, aristocratic, and bears a title. He seems to be pure and gallant towards women, taking exception to Albert Crundle whistling at the girls in Chapter 2. While Irma Rock makes herself available to him for a romantic relationship, he appears to remain obsessed with the memory of the ethereal and virginal Miranda, whom he continues to encounter in the motif of the Miranda Swan. He has risked and compromised his own health in order to retrieve her from the rock. All of these qualities and actions demonstrate the overlap between the white vanishing trope and the Sir Galahad trope in Picnic at Hanging Rock. Michael is a Fitzhubert, of course, and we first meet him when, by coincidence, he accompanies his aunt and uncle on the annual Fitzhubert picnic party to Hanging Rock. The triviality of this occasion is underlined in the following passage and contrasts starkly with the antiquity of the rock. Now at last the Lakeview lawns were deserted, the marquee dismantled, the trestle tables carried away into storage for another year. A few sleepy starlings were still gossiping in the tallest trees as the pink silk-shaded lamps of Mrs. Fitzhubert's drawing room broke into a rosy glow. Out at the Hanging Rock, the long violet shadows were tracing their million-year-old pattern of summer evenings across its secret face. We know that Joan Lindsay was fascinated by the concept of time. Her autobiography is entitled Time Without Clocks. She must then have enjoyed writing the passage in Chapter 2 when the timepieces of Mr. Hussey and Miss McCraw both freeze at midday. This is a more obvious statement on the temporal alterity of the rock and its environs, but one that is very much in line with the frozen time trope. We also know that Lindsay is keen in the novel to create a ripple effect, which she achieves at a number of levels, one of which relates to time. While it is obvious that European timekeeping becomes subverted at the rock itself, the ultimate collapse of time occurs not in the bush, but at Appleyard College, where chronological and calendar time begin to lose definition. After Irma is rescued from the rock, the narrator obliquely references several seasons, which gives a false impression of a considerable amount of time having passed since the girls first disappeared. Yet, Mrs. Appleyard reflects only a few lines later that it was, quote, now nearly a month since the day of the picnic, unquote. As her grip on reality begins to slip, Mrs. Appleyard forgets to wind her clock, and when she herself ascends the Hanging Rock, she is struck by what it meant to climb the rock, quote, on a hot afternoon as the lost girls had climbed it long, long ago, unquote. The girls now belong to a mythological timelessness to which European linear time is no longer relevant. The girls who climb the rock pass into myth, becoming both ahistorical and timeless. Past and present temporalities begin to coalesce, as is the case for Irma late in the novel, when her recollections of the picnic return to consciousness. Notice how Lindsay accentuates this blurring of time by moving from the present perfect tense to the present indicative tense. Down at the lodge, Irma too has heard the clock strike 5. Only half awake and staring out at a garden slowly taking on colour and outline for the coming day. At the Hanging Rock, the first grey light is carving out the slabs and pinnacles of its eastern face, or perhaps it is sunset. It is the afternoon of the picnic, and the 4 girls are approaching the pool. Again she sees the flash of the creek, the wagonette under the blackwood trees, and a fair-haired young man sitting on the grass reading a newspaper. those who argue that Lindsay uses her novel to show how the forces of British colonialism have sought to repress, contain and even obliterate nature while disempowering the indigenous peoples in their lands. It's certainly true that these phenomena can be observed or interpreted as features of the text. However, I remain unconvinced that Lindsay gave any great place in her authorial agenda in Picnic at Hanging Rock to the deliberate subversion of a colonialist paradigm. Her fascination with the metaphysical qualities of the rock seems to stem from her interest in spiritualism and the paranormal. As a consequence, the bush receives a rather sympathetic and positive treatment in places. Indeed, Lindsay's depiction of the otherness of the undefined may suggest that the forces of colonialism are not absolute in their power, or this perception may be as a consequence of other different authorial priorities. In Janelle McCulloch's 2017 book, Beyond the Rock, she tells a rather embellished version of the circumstances which led to Joan Lindsay writing Picnic at Hanging Rock. McCulloch's overwrought narrative is nevertheless based on a set of reliable facts, and her account of that propitious day in 1966 on which Lindsay began to write her novel is a fascinating one. Joan had woken that morning with the flecked remnants of a peculiar dream imprinted on the edges of her conscience. She knew immediately that it would make a good book. The dream had centered on a summer picnic at a place called Hanging Rock, which Joan knew well from her childhood holidays. Joan said that the dream had felt so real that when she awoke at 7:30 a.m., she could still feel the hot summer breeze blowing through the gum trees, and she could still hear the peals of laughter and conversation of the people she'd imagined, and their gaiety and lightness of spirit as they set out on their joyful picnic expedition. As the cold winter's day wore on, Joan continued to remember the dream of the picnic at Hanging Rock with unusual clarity. She spent most of that day trying to write it all down. That night she had the dream again, and the next day she rushed to write the narrative before it escaped her. This happened again the next night, and then every night for a week. Lindsay wrote furiously for 2 weeks and finished her novel. What I find particularly important for our present purposes is the lack of any starting point which emerges out of an indignant concern for Indigenous peoples, or their cultures and traditional lands. It's true that Lindsay was fascinated by the bush, but it is a fascination which derives more from her interest in spiritualism than any form of literary activism on the part of a colonized people. At no stage did she ever articulate an agenda for the novel which included the conventional aims of postcolonial literature. It so happens, of course, that the setting and the time period of her novel coincide with a formative phase in Australia's history of white settlement and the concurrent disenfranchisement and erasing of Indigenous cultures. Fortunately, by capturing this moment in time, Lindsay has unintentionally provided substantial material for a postcolonial reading, informed more by recent sensitivities to historical and cultural injustices. Remember that Lindsay wrote Picnic at Hanging Rock in 1967, just 5 years after the passing of the Commonwealth Electoral Act, which in 1962 granted all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people the option to enrol and vote in federal elections. My question being, how sensitive were the 1960s and its authors to the abuses of colonialism in Australia? As we come to a close, I want to encourage you to continue your analysis of the text, and I suggest that you use these 3 questions which have underpinned our present analysis as a means of focusing on a postcolonial reading. 1. Does Picnic at Hanging Rock ultimately reinforce or subvert colonialist tropes? 2. How sympathetic is Lindsay to Australia's Indigenous culture and history? And 3. Does Lindsay lionise or demonise the Australian bush? I hope it's now becoming clear from the territory we have covered in this episode Just how applicable that concept of intersectionality with which we started is to Picnic at Hanging Rock. There are, as we have seen, numerous overlapping tropes in the novel which add interest, complexity and intrigue to a story which has justifiably assumed an iconic status in the canon of Australian fiction.